Praise the Lord. Well, this morning we're going to continue looking at the 18th century English translations, where we have found, for the most part, we are talking about some type of revision, correction of the KJV. In most of these cases, the revision has been in the form of a privately done paraphrase. Now, we stopped last time with the second one, the second translation that I wanted to mention during the 1700s, and that was Daniel Whitby's, entitled A Paraphrase and Commentary on the New Testament in 2 volumes. Now, do you remember what was significant about Daniel Whitby's translation? Okay, found in the notes in his commentary was perhaps the first full-scale introduction, or the first full-scale treatise, as much as a commentary on Scripture could provide, or notes in a paraphrase on the New Testament could provide, of the post-millennial view. And I listed some scholars that, since that time, have been influenced by Daniel Whitby's beliefs, such as Charles Hodge, such as A.H. Strong, such as Lorraine Bettner, and there are a few others that we could throw on the list just to complete that, some other well-knowns. First of all, 2 Puritan writers, John Owen, who happened to be a 17th century Puritan writer, which would then mean that perhaps he was one of the ones not influenced by Whitby, but yet around the same time, different men are coming up with this same theory of postmillennialism. And another living during the time after Whitby, the New England colonial Puritan scholar, Jonathan Edwards, was also post-mill. And there's just a whole list of people that we could go through. Benjamin Warfield, B.B. Warfield, was also post-mill. And you're going to find most of these, all of the ones I'm giving you with the exception of 2, and those were 2 last week, you'll find that most of these are men that lived prior to the First World War. After World War I, we kind of have a change in millennial theories. Now, of course, this class is not a class on millennial theories, but I thought I would just mention that again to make sure you remember that. And it's because of this fact that you find so many people in the evangelical church, which would include all Reformed people, do not believe in premillennialism. And they're always saying, well, you premills got your beliefs from J.N. Darby in his Bible and from C.I. Scofield in his Bible. It wasn't something believed by the early church. It wasn't something believed by all the writers from, let's say, Augustine through Luther and Calvin. That you're basing that on the notes or commentary in 2 earlier Bibles, both of which we'll get to sooner or later in this class, and the first of those very soon, J.N. Darby's Bible, back in the early 1800s. And then what pre-mills failed to take note of, something they've probably never been taught before, is that post-mill people also base their views on notes or commentary in someone's Bible, Daniel Whitby's Bible. It's just that it is a Bible that is not nearly as well known as either Scofield's or Darby's. And then we're seeing a modern revival of post-mill eschatology, I think under the pen of a scholar down at Gordon Conwell, Jack Davis. And I mentioned this book, and I remembered to bring it this morning. It's a recently published book by Baker entitled Christ's Millennial Kingdom by John Jefferson Davis. So I'll pass this around, and you can take a look at that as we go along this morning. But remember that about Daniel Whitby and his Bible. Here we've got, for the first time, a systemization, a popularization of post-mill eschatology. And we've seen notable scholars down through the years who have believed this. And you could go down the list. I mean, perhaps most of the important scholars, let's say in the end of the 1800s, were certainly not pre-mill. Most of them were probably post-mill. A few were all-mill. Another one that comes to mind is Robert R.L. Dabney. He was probably the most famous Southern Presbyterian the turn of the century, from 1850 to 1900. He has his own, volumes on systematic theology, and you could just go on with the list of important post-mills. But some of these names I think you're more familiar with than others, like A.H. Strong, Charles Hodge, Jonathan Edwards, B.B. Warfield, and maybe people like John Owen. So let's continue looking at our list. I don't want to turn this into a class on millennial theory, but the biblical theory of the millennium is certainly premillennialism. If we desire to interpret the Scriptures, we desire to look at them and read them honestly, literally, faithfully, it's the only millennial theory you can end up with. What I want to do this morning is continue with the translations occurring during the 1700s. So since I've already given you two, you may want to start with number 3 this morning, and it just has to be attached then to the last two, Samuel Clark's and Daniel Whitby's, that we discussed last Sunday. And wrap this study up by looking at all of the important ones, or somewhat important ones, during the 1700s. So number three, I don't have a specific date on this, but it was early 1700s. A work by Thomas Pyle, P-Y-L-E, that was entitled Paraphrase on Acts and All the Epistles. Paraphrase on Acts and All the Epistles. Number 4, 1718. The Common Translation, which would mean the KJV, the Common Translation corrected with a paraphrase and notes. Common Translation corrected with a paraphrase and notes. Now, have you noticed how often we see the word paraphrase in the name? Well, that's what I said. That's one key to determining when a lot of these translations were done. The vast majority of these are paraphrases. And the vast majority of these are nothing but the New Testament. And the vast majority of these are privately done works, not by a committee, but by an individual. This, again, is just the New Testament. It was done by the mathematician Edward Wells. Edward Wells. Now, he published his own Greek text. He published his own Greek text with the English translation alongside it, as well as notes. And the English translation was paraphrastic. One small note on Edward Wells' translation is this. His was the first entire New Testament printed not following the Textus Receptus. It's the first entire New Testament to be printed in English, not following the TR, the Textus Receptus, according to the Elsevier's Brothers blurb. And number 5, 1729. The New Testament in Greek and English was the title of this work, in 2 volumes. So it's going to be similar to Wells in the sense that it has 2 languages. It's bilingual. It was done by a Presbyterian minister, Daniel Mace, M-A-C-E. Now, like Wells, he too gave us the Greek text alongside his corrected AV, or KJV. They're all trying to, correct what the KJV has had to say by, well, in this regard, updating the language, updating it so much that I think we could say of Mace's translation that he really majored on the then current colloquialisms. It wasn't a good translation. Most of these aren't. I mean, by far, most of these aren't. If they were, they'd still be in print. The KJV would have gone out of print, and this would be in its place. But they aren't. They're paraphrases that take lots and lots of liberties with the text. Mace's certainly does, because it's packed full, choked full of then current colloquialisms that would be then current, that might help people then understand the Bible. But if they're not current now, then the Bible is as antiquated, if not more, than the KJV. But I have to say something positive about this Presbyterian minister, Daniel Mace. As a textual student, he was probably more than a century ahead of his time in his theories in textual criticism. He was not so in favor with the Textus Receptus. He singled out 1 John 5:7. You know, that's our heavenly witness passage. He singled that out, disapproving of it very strongly, because he said it doesn't have the manuscript support. He knew the Erasmus story that went along with that Erasmus had challenged someone, well, if you can find it, then I'll put it in, and someone goes and writes a manuscript and put it in, and Erasmus is bound by the words of his mouth. And Mace was familiar with this, and therefore thought it was somewhat dishonest to include something like this heavenly witness passage in 1 John 5:7 in his work. Well, it's not until the 19th century, the 1800s, when textual criticism really takes off as a biblical science and study. And so I'm saying that Mace is more than 100 years ahead of his time in his theories on textual criticism. He didn't elaborate all of them and systematize it like, well, Samuel Tregelles did. But he had ideas such as, well, now, which should we take, harder or easier reading, or longer or shorter reading, or more ancient reading or more numerous reading? I mean, the one that's more ancient or the one that's supported by more manuscripts, though those manuscripts are of recent origin. He played around with a lot of these thoughts and theories, and he was certainly on his way to a good theory of textual criticism, and he was 100 years ahead of his time. If you'll open your KJV over to James chapter 3, and I believe this starts with around verse 5. James 3:5. Let me read how he translates this. So in other words, we've got some good things as well as some that maybe are not so good we could say about Mace. He's way ahead of his time as a textual critic, but the paraphrase and some of his translations leave a lot to be desired. But this I found to be a very interesting translation of James 3. The tongue is but a small part of the body, yet how grand are its pretensions. Exclamation point, by the way, after that. A spark of fire! Exclamation point. What quantities of timber will it blow into a flame? Exclamation point. The tongue is a brand that sets the world in a combustion. It is but one of the numerous organs of the body, yet it can blast whole assemblies. Tipped with infernal sulfur, it sets the whole train of life in a blaze. That's a pretty good translation as far as power. That's a powerful translation there. Let me read that to you again. The tongue is a small part of the body, yet how grand are its pretensions, a spark of fire. What quantities of timber will it blow into a flame? The tongue is a brand that sets the world in a combustion. It is but one of the numerous organs of the body, yet it can blast whole assemblies. Tipped with infernal sulfur, it sets the whole train of life in a blaze. James's thoughts there are very to the point. The tongue is a powerful member for good and for evil. And Mace just does his best to bring out what he thought James was saying. So there's Daniel Mace in his translation, 1729. Then, number 6, from the years 1739 through 1752. 1739 through 1752, paraphrase on the New Testament. 3 volumes by John Guyse, Guyse. A work that was reprinted several times, the second half of the 18th century. Important enough during that day for those people to have it reprinted on several occasions. Then number 7, 1745. What was called the primitive New Testament. The primitive New Testament. By, let's see if you remember who this man is. You probably won't, but we'll try it anyway. By William Whiston. not for the KJV, but yes, he's best known as being a translator. A translator of what? Well, let me go a little earlier, and then we'll come back to that. He's first of all known as the successor, the chair of science at Cambridge University of Sir Isaac Newton. And you've heard of Sir Isaac Newton. Whiston, I mean, he's that intelligent. He was the successor, the chair of science at Cambridge University of Sir Isaac Newton. But he's more famous today for another reason. He is the translator of Josephus. Most of the translations of Josephus today that you have, most of the editions and books are based on the translation of William Whiston. I've said that a long time ago, but you probably don't recall that. But you can look up in your Josephus volumes, and you'll probably see the original translator goes way back into the mid-18th century, over 200 years ago, and that was William Whiston. Well, primitive New Testament was accomplished when Whiston was 78 years old. Still had mental faculties when he was that age to produce this New Testament. But it certainly has its faults. By the way, there's a more modern translation of Josephus. We probably need one. I mean, that was 250 years ago. Surely we understand the language better in which Josephus wrote now than we did then. But it's kind of hard to outdo Whiston because everything has been done by him, it seems like. But anyway, back to his primitive New Testament. He approved of the Western text type, or what today is known. Of course, it wasn't known then as Western text type. They didn't have all those names in. That's 19th century biblical scholarship. But he approved of what we call today, shall we say, the Western text type. Therefore, he made considerable use of Codex Bezique, which of course is the chief Western, for his Gospels and Acts. This will tie in with what we've been studying in Acts and ITP. I've said that you've got many Western interpolations, or many, let's say, Western variants to consider whenever you're studying the book of Acts. And a whole lot of these are on the basis of Codex Bezique. You find some in the Gospels as well, but I think more in Acts than any other book in the New Testament. If you have the New International Commentary, no, I take that back. Yes, that's right, the New International Commentary on the New Testament by F.F. Bruce, then most of the notes at the footnotes at the bottom of his page deal with variants from the Western text type, comparing those with T.R. and Alexandrian and so forth. Now, Bezique was a bilingual. We've already looked at one bilingual thus far, or two, but they've all been Greek and English. This was a Latin and Greek bilingual. Now, not Whiston's primitive New Testament. That'd have to be English. We're talking about Codex Bezique, which was a major codex that he used. And it was Whiston's claim, certainly incorrectly, that this codex was written not 30 years after the death of the Apostle John. Well, we wish we had a full codex that was that close to the original authors of the New Testament. But that's a fabulous claim, though. Codex Bezique, as we have studied earlier in textual criticism, dates from the 5th or 6th century A.D. As textual critics today know, it dates from the 5th or 6th century A.D., not from 30 years after the Apostle John's death. We've got a little small papyrus fragment, some of the P manuscripts that date as early as 25 years after the Apostle John's death, but it's only 2 verses in the Gospel of John. We certainly don't have a whole codex that dates that early. And if you'll flip over to Luke chapter 6 and verse 5, he has a rather strange reading here, and I'll read it and you compare with what the KJV has. All these people attempting to correct the KJV, Luke 6:5, a rather strange reading that again will test your knowledge from the past, see whether you recall this. This is another one of those shady things, so your memory may be blank on this matter. But it reads very much like some of the earlier, a certain earlier thing that we've looked at. He has in Luke 6:5, on the same day, seeing one working on the Sabbath, he said unto him, Man, if thou knowest what thou doest, thou art blessed. But if thou dost not know, thou art cursed, and art a transgressor of the law. On the same day, seeing one working on the Sabbath, he said unto him, Man, if thou knowest what thou doest, thou art blessed. But if thou dost not know, thou art cursed, and art a transgressor of the law. Does that remind you of any group of strange sayings that we've discussed in the past? Well, these so-called oxyrhynchus sayings of Jesus have readings that are extremely similar to his translation of Luke chapter 6 and verse 5. The so-called oxyrhynchus. Oxyrhynchus. Kind of a difficult word to spell. They're known as the Oxyrhynchus. That's a place in Egypt, named after the place in which they were found. The Oxyrhynchus sayings of Jesus. I brought a list of those before. Whenever those were first discovered at the turn of the century, scholars were so excited about that. These are what we call agrapha, or that's what they would claim. These are agrapha. Paul mentions one agraphon in Acts 20. I'd have to be around verse 36. I don't have the specific verse down. You can look that up. But around Acts 20, 36, or 37, Paul mentions one, and it's the only one that we have in the New Testament, so it's the only reliable one we have. But what we mean by agrapha, or by an agraphon, is an extra biblical saying. That is a saying of Jesus not recorded in the Gospels, not recorded, by the Gospel writers, those who are writing, quote, biographies, unquote, of his life, but yet they give us a true, reliable statement of his. The Oxyrhynchus sayings, discovered at the turn of the century, propose to give us a whole list of sayings that Jesus said. He said this and he said that. You can't find it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. But are we not to at least assume that the early church carried on down through oral tradition statements that Jesus made that were not necessarily found in Scripture? Paul comes up with one of these where Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive. And he quotes him over in Acts chapter 20. But you can't find that anywhere in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. So a so-called agraphon, or group of agrapha. So that's a strange reading in Luke 6:5. And we don't really know the relationship, let's say, between this and what we know to be the Oxyrhynchus sayings. But the Oxyrhynchus sayings have a lot to do with law. They're always talking about law. And we see in this quotation, the very end of it, if you don't know what you are doing, you're cursed and you're a transgressor of the law. It seems like maybe we have a group of legalistically minded people that gave rise to the origin of the Oxyrhynchus papyri. So, William Whiston, successor to Sir Isaac Newton at Cambridge, and famous today as a translator of the works of Josephus. Number 8 this morning, which I'll just date the mid-1700s, because we've got 3 works I'm going to fit here. Let's keep it all under number 8 though. First of all, we have paraphrase and version of the New Testament. Paraphrase and version of the New Testament by Philip Doddridge. And I'll tell you why we put these 3 together here in a moment. Paraphrase and version of the New Testament by Philip Doddridge. Then we have translation of the 4 Gospels with a commentary. Translation of the 4 Gospels with a commentary. By George Campbell. Then we have translation of all the apostolical letters. All the apostolical letters. By J. McKnight. These then were all edited and published together in one volume in the year 1818. Notice that you've got, first of all, with Doddridge, the whole New Testament. Then with Campbell, you've got 4 Gospels. Then with McKnight, you have the apostolical epistles, the epistles of the apostles. And so these would be edited, and overlapping could be, done away with. And then you have a publication in 1818 of all 3 of these works. But individually, they all came forth in the mid-18th century, the mid-1700s. And then number 9 this morning, one that we won't have to discuss much because we've got a full tape on it, the halfway mark of this century, 1749, 1750. We have what we have studied as the Chelloner edition of the Reims Douay Bible, so that it now is known as Reims Douay Chelloner. And all modern editions, which of course this is a Roman Catholic Bible, one of several available to Roman Catholic people today, but all modern editions are based on the revision of this man Chelloner. We have dealt with this. That was the end of last April on Lit Tape 165. So I just throw it in here to show you where it fits with some of the other works. Of course, we were studying Latin translations, and that's why we put that back there, although, of course, we're talking about an English translation here, but I'm saying translated from the Latin. But we were looking at Jerome and the Vulgate, and we got up into the various later translations of the Vulgate, and then we looked at Reims and Douay, which were English Bibles, but done by Roman Catholics, the college at Reims and later Douay. And then we have the Chelloner revision of the Reims Douay Catholic Bible, the year 1749, 1750. Now, he gave us several revisions, but this was the standard one. This was like his second or whatever. I don't recall that now. He gave us like 7 revisions of R.D., Reims Douay. But the final one, the one that's lasted, was the one that was published in 1749, 1750, and now it is R.D.C., Reims Douay Chelloner edition. Number 10, 1764, a work by Robert Wynne. It's not important. Number 11, 1764, a work entitled New and Literal Translation. It was done by an American colonial Quaker, a fairly important work for that day, by a Quaker by the name of Anthony Fervor. And it has become known since that time. It's not available today, but there are manuscript copies of it as the Quaker's Bible. Because Anthony Fervor was a Quaker. His complaint was the, and I quote, many obsolete, uncouth, and clownish, end of quote, phrases found in the KJV. I mean, everyone has to have some reason that starts him on the road of revising and correcting the ancient KJV. His complaint was there are many obsolete, uncouth, clownish phrases found in the KJV. Obsolete, uncouth, and clownish. I wonder which ones he had in mind. Well, let me give you a sampling of some of the obsolete, uncouth, clownish words he had in mind. And maybe he thought they were clownish because he was a Quaker. Because the first word is this word, joyous. Quakers were serious people, very serious people. So you can't ever be joyous. Joyous, solace, S-O-L-A-C-E, damsel, dayspring, I don't know why all these were singled out, but these were some of the ones that Perver had a problem with. He's got a difficult name to pronounce. You're always tempted to mispronounce it. Bereaved, marvels, M-A-R-V-E-L-S, marvels, and bondmen. But, when I look at those words, there really seems to be little problem with the words. I think he had a problem somewhere in his mind. I don't know why he picked these out, and there's a whole list of others, but these were some of the ones I came across that Anthony Perver had a problem with. And then over in Matthew chapter 6, in the model prayer, you know how it starts, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Well, his translation was, rather than hallowed be thy name, sacredly reverenced be thy name. I think hallowed sounds too much like hollow. You have an empty name. You have a hollow name. So that would be very distasteful to refer to the deity with such a term. But hallowed means anything but hollow. They're almost spelled the same, but they mean two entirely different things. And then in the Song of Solomon, chapter 2 and verse 12, we have in the KJV, the flowers appear on the earth. And he gives us a little imagery here. The earth's lap displays her infant flowers. He's almost attempting to be a poet there, it sounds like. The earth's lap displays her infant flowers. Well, so much for what became known as the Quaker's Bible. If you ever come across that, you'll know it was Anthony Perver's work, the Quaker's Bible, 1764. Number 12, 1768. Here was the title for the work. You only really have need of getting down the first 5 or 6 words. A liberal translation of the New Testament being an attempt to translate the sacred writings with the same freedom, spirit, and elegance with which other English translations from the Greek classics have lately been executed. Well, what we know it by is liberal translation. Now, not literal. Perver's was new and literal. This is liberal, L-I-B, not L-I-T. It does make a difference. One is literal, the other's not. The other's non-literal, which is liberal. A liberal translation of the New Testament. And the rest of the title being an attempt to translate the sacred writings with the same freedom, spirit, and elegance with which other English translations from the Greek classics have lately been executed. Other works are being translated that were very beautiful, and I guess he thought that maybe the KJV didn't stand up with the other new works being translated, and so let's redo it. It was done by the classical and biblical scholar Edward Harwood. Edward Harwood. Remember, it's not literal, it's liberal, a very free paraphrase. Let me give you a couple of examples. I'll read one that's a little more lengthy. A few examples of a liberal translation. First of all, Mark 12:32. We've got the young lawyer who's come to Jesus saying, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And so he gives the commandments and the greatest and the least of these, and which is the great and which is the least. Well, his response in 12:32, the clergyman said, "You have given him the only right and proper answer." So that's bringing it up to date, instead of the scribe said, which is probably what the KJV has, or the lawyer, the clergyman said. In Luke 15:11, chapter in Luke where we have 3 parables of lost sheep, lost coin, lost son, also known as the prodigal son. A gentleman of splendid family and opulent fortune had 2 sons. A gentleman of splendid family and opulent fortune had 2 sons. And then this one's even weirder. 1 Corinthians 15:51. This is the rapture passage here. It will not all die, but will be changed in a moment, the twinkling of an eye, and the last trump. Well, here's what he has. We shall not pay the common debt of nature. what that is death. We shall not pay the common debt of nature, but by a soft transition we shall go up. But by a soft transition we shall go up. And then listen to this rendition of the so-called model prayer in Matthew 6. O thou great governor and parent of universal nature. Sounds like an atheist edition of the model prayer. O thou great governor and parent. Which gender is it then? Parent of universal nature, who manifestest thy glory to the blessed inhabitants of heaven. You were probably, if you heard this, not even connected to the model prayer. It's so liberal. May all thy rational creatures in all the parts of thy boundless dominion be happy in the knowledge of thy existence and providence, and celebrate thy perfections in a manner most worthy thy nature and perfective of their own. That's the model prayer. I would never make the connection between the two. O thou great governor and parent of universal nature. Sounds like a Unitarian or a Universalist is what it sounds like to me. Well, number 13, the year 1768, a work entitled The New Testament with Notes. The New Testament with Notes for the plain, unlettered man who knows only his mother tongue. The New Testament with Notes for the plain, unlettered man or men who knew or knows only their mother tongue. Who do you think is the author of this work? Think we ought to pause? We got enough time till you can guess him. Who's living during 1768? Pardon? No? You're kind of close. It's a well-known figure, that's for sure. We better go on the other side of the Atlantic, though. Let's go over to England. Who's a famous preacher living during this time in England? You're checking your church. No, you're checking your church history notes now in your mind. He was the founder of a modern denomination. Wesley, John Wesley, was the translator of this New Testament. I think I've got this in Wesley's writings. New Testament with Notes. And that sounds like Wesley to give it this name, for the plain, unlettered man, because they were very big on that you don't need education, you need the second blessing, sanctification. And although Wesley was a very, very educated man, I don't mean to demean him by that statement, but he felt that the religion was for the common man, that it wasn't for all these high puff-up, blow-ups somewhere. But Wesley was highly educated. Everywhere Wesley went, he carried books with him, and he read and read and read and read. He read Plato and Aristotle, and he discussed philosophy with people and metaphysics, and you would never really know that from Methodism today. But Wesley was a very pronounced, profound scholar, although he was wrong about many things. This was a very conservative revision of the KJV, which also stands to reason, coming from the pen of John Wesley. A very conservative revision. We're not going into all of this, by a soft transition we'll go up business. An earlier edition may have come out in 1755, and a later one did in 1790. But I was unable to confirm this earliest date. So I'll give you the date 1768. An earlier edition of this work, I'm saying, may have come out in 1755, but I have been unable to confirm that date. I know one comes out in 1768. That would make it either the first or the second one of Wesley. And I know another one came out in 1790, which would either be the second or the third, depending on what we do with this 1755 date. But it doesn't matter. Number 14, 1770. A work by J. Worsley. W-O-R-S-L-E-Y. Published posthumously in the, and I quote him, present idiom of the English tongue. So again, we have someone desiring to update the language. This is in the present idiom of the English tongue. Number 15, 1778. this is unique with regard to everything else we have studied, a translation of Isaiah. For the first time we've gone to the Old Testament. A translation of Isaiah, a very scholarly work by this man, R. Lowth, L-O-W-T-H. A very scholarly work. So it's unlike any of the others we've looked at thus far. A scholarly work, intended more or less for scholars. It's not a paraphrase, although it is something that's done privately. It's not free and liberal like so many of the others. It's a very technical, very scholarly work, but one that has not survived today. Number 16, 1791. A translation of the New Testament with notes. A translation of the New Testament with notes, 1791. By Gilbert Wakefield. You ever heard that name before, Gilbert Wakefield? He was a prominent Unitarian back in those days. Gilbert Wakefield. Remember I said before that it has been said that the man Daniel Whitby who gave us postmillennialism turned Unitarian later in life. And I think these won't be the first two times, or the only two times, rather, that we see men who are Unitarians, who became Unitarians later, or who are Unitarians whenever they're doing their translating work. And because we have a lot of Unitarians during this time. Unitarian Christianity, which of course is a contradiction of terms, but Unitarian Christianity is very dominant in the 17 and 1800s. And very dominant, of course, in New England. Number 17, the year 1796. We've got a work by one of England's great ecclesiastical leaders of the 18th century, Archbishop William Newcomb. Archbishop William Newcomb, one of England's great ecclesiastical leaders of the 18th century. Now, he gave us in the year 1778 in Harmony of the Gospels, the very early Harmony of the Gospels. Tatian's Diatessaron was, of course, probably the earliest. That's back to the 2nd century. But here's a Harmony of the Gospels. In 1785, he gave us a translation of the 12 minor prophets. In 1788, a translation of Ezekiel. In 1792, he even wrote a history of English Bible translations, which is what we're doing now. 1792, he gave us a history of English Bible translations. But then in 1796, his whole work comes out, which was a translation of the entire Bible, and its name was An Attempt Towards Revising Our English Translation of the Greek Scriptures. Some of the Old was based on the Greek and not the Hebrew for him. An attempt towards revising our English translation of the Greek Scriptures. 1796. First time now we have essentially the whole Bible, the whole KJV now that has been so-called corrected, updated, and revised. And then I'm going to stop this morning with the next one, number 18, because we've run out of the 18th century. 1798, a little-known work by a man in Scarlet. In Scarlet. So let's stop with that so we get most all. Well, since I did go back and bring into this message the last two from last message, which were the first two of the 18th century, the 1700s, and we'll have in this message all of the translations that I want to say anything about that were revisions or corrections of the KJV that came out in the 1700s. Now you can see what we've just done then. In 1 hour, less than an hour, we've covered 100 years. Remember how long it took us with just the KJV or just the 1500s. It speeds up, really speeds up until later into the 1800s, and it slows back down again. And then when you hit the 1900s, it really slows down because you've got translation after translation after translation. So we'll start with the early 19th century translations next time.